days. They've halted all the orders that are in factories today, and this has really made a lot of really challenge times for a lot of suppliers. What we will start to see here, I think, is the movement towards either some organizations are being smart and looking at financing through different kinds of fintechs. Others, like BHP, are accelerating payment of invoices. Vodafone announced it would pay European suppliers within 15 days. Lockheed Martin is advancing more than $50 million to small and medium enterprises. So making sure that we stabilize the financial networks in our supply chain is important, because if we don't, then in 6 months, we may, when the economy starts to recover, we may step on the gas and discover that all of our suppliers are bankrupt. So I think there's a process here to think about, which suppliers represent, 80% of our direct spending. It's generally about 20% of suppliers, and targeting those that can receive some kind of financial aid or some support during this period. The relational networks are important, and this is really where communication and trust is really important. And this is an investment, as I said, that when you have a crisis and you have a good relationship, people can work together to get things done. They can get through it. And this investment in relationship builds trust, which essentially is, in my definition, is a series of small promises kept. So the relationships that we have with suppliers are key, and that may involve improving communications, talking to them, talking to your workforce, understanding people's anxiety. And if you don't communicate with people, then you get what's called the MSU, or making stuff up phenomenon, where rumor mills are now driving information, and people are acting based on false impressions of what is going on. And I think that we've seen this a lot also in terms of the distance that we have with a lot of Asian suppliers. That psychological distance, allows us to, for those in the West, to maybe think, well, we have to take care of ourselves first. We can't worry about what's going on to somebody halfway around the world in a country that doesn't speak English. And there are some buyers who are thinking that way, that are distancing themselves. But the reality is that we do have these important and strong relationships with suppliers, and communication is really important. We're starting to see some organizations are renegotiating contracts. A lot of people are relying on force majeure contracts to try to cut off their suppliers. This is a bad decision, all in all. I think it involves really rethinking how we deal with contractual relationships, because contracts ultimately are simply an article that represents a relationship, and we have to look at the spirit of how that contract was written, rather than rely on force majeure clauses or payment clauses that will essentially cut people off, cut off our suppliers, and building up that loyalty can take years again. And we're seeing that right now, where 15, 20-year relationships are being cut off through cutting off of payments. As we move towards a post-COVID world, I think this visibility of the network is going to be key. And I think we have to start thinking about, again, our relationship flows, our financial flows, our physical flows, and this can lead us to our information flows. And as we increase visibility, as we increase insights into what's happening in our supply chain, we can start to use data as the vehicle for discussions and of what to do about this problem. Today, I think what's happening is many people are flying blind. They don't know what's happening. There really isn't any strong leadership that's running this response to COVID. Certainly in the United States, there's a complete lack of leadership that's causing a lot of mayhem in the market. All the different states are sort of negotiating against one another to get supplies, which is causing a chaotic marketplace. In Europe, to some extent, it's the same thing with different countries are now cutting off exports to one another and are sort of using resources just to cover their own requirements. So I think we have to start thinking more collaboratively. This is a virus that has to that will impact the entire human race. So it doesn't understand borders. It doesn't understand tariffs. It doesn't care. It goes after whatever human body, whatever host it can take advantage of. And we need to think about this as well, especially for some of the poorer countries, less developed countries, not only in Africa but in other places, that will really struggle to get out of this particular situation. They may not be there. Some of these countries may take a long time to recover. Some of them may dissolve. And we have to be thinking about how do we get the entire human race into a position where we can restart the global economy and not overlook any particular entity or country or region or opportunity to bring everyone along. This is where I think that the idea of adaptive leadership really comes into play. Leadership is really a function of being able to understand, a macro view of what's happening in terms of political insights, getting past the politics, looking at the economic flows, looking at policies and regulations, harmonizing a lot of those components that can take down a lot of the barriers between institutions, between countries. And this health pandemic is indeed one of the biggest barriers for business. We're going to see a good proportion of the population in the U.S. It's about 35 million that really won't have jobs. And these are the bartenders, the barbers, the people who work in the service industry, and many of those jobs just don't exist, and they may be a long time coming back as people very slowly start to come back to work. Tourism, luxury industries, anything related to travel, these will also be very slow to come back. So, I think what we might see, and this is sort of a prediction, is, we have a bit of a crisis in leadership at the moment. And whoever is the new set of leaders will have to be thinking about how do we get the benefits of localization. And I think we will start to see increased localization, increased local supply bases, especially for healthcare critical items. So there will be some onshoring or reshoring of manufacturing, I believe, to the localization, but without destroying, a lot of the global channels that will likely not go away. In technology will likely remain in China. Low-cost manufacturing of apparel will likely remain in Bangladesh. But how do we preserve these supply chains while at the same time starting to move towards localization of some supply chains? And I think this is where, again, leadership and understanding this macro picture of building the right trade policies, creating a competency that is able to deal with the complexity, but also be adaptive to think about all of the changes that are likely to occur. In a post-COVID world, we're very likely to see a vaccine at some point emerge, but I don't think it'll be a single vaccine. I think there will be an annual vaccine. And I think we will see these pandemics come back again, not in this form, but I think in the next time around, we're hopefully going to be better prepared. And there may be other kinds of global crises that will impact supply chains, but hopefully not for a while. But I think this is really causing us to rethink our capabilities, and it's certainly a time where we need leaders who can start to think about the impact of all of these things. So I've gone through a very quick kind of overview, but I would love to be able to open it up for some questions and maybe discuss this a little bit further.
Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you too in terms of leading that into talking about where we go beyond this and the change and disruption. when we were last able to meet in person in the US, you know, I was at one of your events where we were talking at that time about the impact of the trade wars between the United States and China on global supply chains in the United States. And what would this mean in terms of where we're looking at more regionalized trade blocks potentially going forward? So from my side of things, what's the likelihood from your side of the world that you think that the tariffs and trade wars will continue after this health pandemic ends?
Well, you know, that's a great question. I think, you know, I think those tariffs, by the way, are still in place in the United States, especially between the U.S. and China. There's been in the news. There's been a number of articles arguing that, you know, if we ever had a time where we needed to take those tariffs down, it would be now, because it's even further slowing and impeding you know, the flow of materials that we desperately need from China, especially in healthcare, in pharmaceuticals, you know, in medicine. In healthcare right now is facing some really dramatic shortages. In the U.S., today I read about a shortage of disinfectants for the hospitals, if you can imagine, and you know, a shortage of propofol, which is used in the intubation process for people who are admitted into an ICU. So we're facing you know, a real problem in terms of these medicines that again are produced in China and India. So the last thing we need really are tariffs. Unfortunately, you know, I think that at least the Trump administration was very pleased with the outcome of the tariffs pre-COVID. They were very happy that China was struggling. China has now seen a massive reduction in their GDP due to COVID, and I think we're going to likely see them continue. Unfortunately, I'm not optimistic that they're going to come down. I think we will actually go into a period of increased national security. People, I think, will move towards sort of localization of the supply base, and that will further heighten, you know, the kinds of trade barriers that we're seeing today. One of my thoughts is, you know, we may likely see not so much a country-specific trade barrier, but I think we may see some regional or trade platforms start to emerge, and we explored this at our workshop. You know, we may see, for instance, Canada, U.S., and Mexico form a trade bloc, and Europe and Eastern Europe and maybe parts of Russia form a trade bloc. I don't know about Russia. What will happen to Russia? They may just sit on their own for a while, and then certainly China and in the southeast, China is very actively pursuing their Belt and Road strategy, which will likely continue. And they really do want to expand across the globe. So I think we will see continued escalation of tariffs and trade wars, and if anything, a movement towards greater localization. I'm sorry to say.
Yes, I'm sorry to say this as well, because it's obviously something that's been keeping me up at night in the last couple of months, particularly because what we can't see is a rise in national borders and moves towards protectionism, because that most disadvantages particularly micro to small to medium enterprises that rely on exporting and being able to enter value chain opportunities. And they need to be able to look at how they can grow their business through those international opportunities, and particularly for those based in least developing economies, who will need to have an even greater recovery period after this, because they're going to be significantly more affected economically. So, you know, from our perspective, it's really quite vital that we maintain this course of not going down that pathway and look at it from a resilience adaptation and an opportunistic perspective to support those two core groups. And I mean, we talked and you touched a little bit on the escalations between China and the US. If you want to expand on that a little further, because even just from the agricultural sector in the US, I know that the States has just had to